So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On my way to the venue this morning, I was in lovely Paris. I said to stop for a coffee, enjoy a nice Parisian cafe, read the newspaper. While I was reading through the newspaper, the focus was very much on climate change. And that's what I'm going to speak about today. There's two main stories. The first one was that 2024 is the hottest year in record. The second was all to do with COP. Leaders throughout the world are meeting this week in Baku to decide what is the best strategy to achieve the Paris Agreement back in 2016. What I'm going to speak about is what we see as the best strategy. And the best strategy is pretty clear. It's to electrify our societies. So what do I mean by electrification? It's pretty simple. So electrifying your society means the following. You switch from running technologies and processes on fossil fuels. That's things like your internal combustion engine cars. That's things like gas. And you switch to clean and renewable technologies. That's electric vehicles. That is heat pumps. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to speak about how that can be done. So let's begin. In essence, to decarbonize, you need to do two things. You need to decarbonize power. And secondly, you need to run as many processes as possible on electricity. With regards to decarbonizing power, the situation is very, very good. We're doing very well. Pascal, in his previous presentation, noted that in France, power is fully decarbonized. In Europe, it's not fully decarbonized, but it's doing pretty good. We're 3/4 decarbonized. The big change, the big revolution has been in renewables. The cost of solar has dropped 90%, 9-0, the past 2 decades. If you add 1/4 of the mix, which is nuclear, then you get to 75%. And looking ahead, the challenge we see as Eurelectric is not a technological one, it's a business one. How can we ensure the necessary investments in renewables, given how cheap they're becoming? Now let's switch to electrifying society. Here the situation is much less positive. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that this decade, 2020s, should be the electric decade. It means we're supposed to electrify our societies. However, the promise is not backed up by reality. When I speak of Europe, and I'm giving a regional presentation today focused just on Europe, we are stagnating on electrification. It's stagnating at 23%. It needs to be 70% by 2050. It's possible. We need policymakers to accept the reality. We also need lots of investments. It's a CAPEX, capital-intensive process. Electrifying society is cheaper overall. The OPEX will be cheaper, but there is an investment cycle which we need to get right. So that's the overview of how you decarbonize society. So I'm going to focus on 4 elements. Firstly, why we should electrify. Secondly, how we can electrify. Thirdly, some of the challenges. And then our solutions. I have 3 in all. So, why we should electrify. 2 main reasons. Firstly, it's faster. When we speak of energy vectors, we accept that we can no longer use fossil fuels. Then the discussion is, do you want to go with a hydrogen-based economy or electricity-based economy? There's a lot of hype on hydrogen. We have nothing against hydrogen. We work closely with the hydrogen sector. But the reality is 96% of hydrogen today is made based on fossil fuels. If I contrast that with electricity, as you see in the graph here, 3/4 of electricity is decarbonized. So switching to electricity makes sense, and the faster you can do it, the better. Secondly, it's just more efficient. In the slide here, I focus on the transport sector. Again, if we look at the options to decarbonize transport, so running our cars on petrol like today, we agree that's not possible. That's not compatible with the climate agreements. Secondly, e-fuels. I think we all agree that the technology and doing it at scale for light-duty vehicles is not feasible. I think we all agree that. So then you're left with hydrogen or electricity. And even just look at the efficiency here. Electric cars are 3 times more efficient than hydrogen cars. As Eurelectric, my association, when it comes to light-duty vehicles, we think the debate is done. Electric vehicles have won. And a challenge for us here in Europe is to ensure we can make these EVs in a competitive manner to compete with other regions throughout the world. So, how should we electrify? When we speak of electrification, there's three main sectors we're discussing: buildings, transport, and industry. So I'm going to begin with industry. It's a sector close to my heart. For 6 years, I was the head of climate and energy policy at the European Metals Association. In producing metals, about 40–50% of your cost is just electricity. When you produce aluminium, you compete globally and you compete on electricity costs. The good news is when we produce aluminium here in France, it's largely decarbonized because it's decarbonized electricity. The issue is other sectors, as in steel, chemicals, etc., still run the processes on fossil fuels. More and more studies are showing that we can electrify a lot of these processes. A lot of things which we previously thought was not possible due to the high temperature needs involved can now be electrified. What we just need is capital investments. So that's industry. Let's now go to buildings. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, as Europe, we came with this idea of the Repower EU strategy. In simple terms, we said we're going to get rid of Russian fossil fuel. That's about 135 BCM of gas with clean, renewable electrification. And we said for the building sector, which obviously is a big user of gas, we are going to dramatically increase the amount of heat pumps in Europe today. We gave the target of 20 million heat pumps by 2026 and 60 million heat pumps by 2030. But if you look at the slide here, the promise is not backed up by reality. Last year, we actually seen a decrease in the amount of heat pump sales. So instead of this dramatic 60 million, it's actually going down. And finally, let's go to the transport sector. In Europe last year, 2 out of every 9 cars was the EV, so 18%. That is good. It's positive compared to where we were. It's 8 million in the past 4 years. We need to get to 30 million by 2030, but it's still not enough. Before the event here, I was speaking to a colleague from Huawei, and he was telling me that maybe 54% or 65% of cars sold in China last year were fully electric. So if the Chinese can do it, why can't we in Europe? And this leads to stagnating electrification rates. As I mentioned before, electrification in Europe has stagnated. If you look at the blue graph here, we're stuck on 23%. And we've been at 23% for over 5 years now. But this is not a global phenomenon, it's a regional phenomenon. If we look at the green, let's look at China. Their electrification rates have increased 7% in the past 7 years. If the Chinese can do it, if they can electrify their societies, why can't we here in Europe? So now I'm going to speak about some of the challenges of integrating renewable electricity. I'm going to focus on 2 main areas. The first is this phenomenon of negative prices. I know a lot of you are not from the electricity sector, so you don't follow these things quite so closely. But in simple terms, negative prices is quite a strange phenomenon where you're paying someone to take your electricity. Yeah? Negative prices per se are not an issue. They're kind of a result of a natural market dynamic, supply and demand. What is an issue, however, is a sustained period of negative prices. And the reason is pretty simple. It totally undermines your investment case in new power generation. And again, if you look at the graph here, 2024, we've seen a record number of negative price hours in Europe. We're paying people to take our electricity. There is solutions out there. We need a more flexible system. We need to dramatically increase energy storage. And finally, we need electrification rates to pick up. Next, let's speak about infrastructure. Renewables. 70%, or between 70 and 80% of renewables will be connected at DSO level. The issue is our grid is not ready for that today. If you look at the graph here, we see the large number of grid requests. That is not backed up by actual requests. We have a long queue, and it's becoming a major issue. Second issue is our grid is aging. Over 30% of our grid is more than 40 years old. We have this very dynamic renewable sector, but we don't have an infrastructure sector to match. And the two need to come together in this transition. So, our solutions as Eurelectric, I'm going to focus on three. First is flexibility. When we speak of electricity, we need to always think of this system. And looking forward, we need to take a systemic approach. In the graph on the left here, we have what's called congestion management. I don't want to go into too much of the details of how electricity markets function, but what we see is that we need a new investment framework to reward those who are investing in the essential services to keep the lights on. People who are investing in the flexibility we need. People who are investing in the storage we need. We need to change the investment framework here in Europe to ensure security of supply. Secondly is storage. Until now, hydropower was the dominant storage technology, and still is today. If you look at the graph on the left, 47 gigawatts, it's hydropower. And you have a small section in gray, which is other storage options. We need a revolution in storage, particularly batteries, like the revolution we've seen in solar and wind PVs. That is key. The news is very positive. The cost of batteries have dropped dramatically. But we need to increase battery development from 4 gigawatts to what we estimate to be 117 gigawatts by 2030. Now, Elon Musk, when he talks about the power system of the future, whatever you think about him, he can be right on some things. He says he expects a power system dominated by solar power and storage batteries. That's how he envisions the system of the future. We really need to build out batteries here in Europe. That is a key thing in the transition. And finally, grids. My organization, Eurelectric, we published a big report called Grids for Speed, which we launched in June of this year. And what we see is that we need to focus on grids, and we need to double the investment in grids from now to 2050. We spend about 33 billion a year in Europe today on grids. That needs to double to 67 billion from now to 2050. Moreover, we need to front-load investments. So we're going to be spending more in this decade in order to be ready for the transition. The second thing the study showed is that we can lower the bill. We can lower this 67 billion to 55 billion with the right technologies. And we talk a few here about grid-forming technologies. We talk things about asset performance excellence, things like grid-friendly flexibility, things like anticipatory investments. All these technologies will result in a lower cost for the customer. And that brings us to an additional one, technology innovation. The people who are going to solve this transition are not people like me, based in Brussels, working on regulations, telling people what to do. It's people like you, people who work in the technologies. And that's what we need. In the graph here, you have Huawei's grid-forming technologies. These are the things which are going to get us where we need to go going forward. So I'm going to finish up now with one simple message. Let's electrify everything that can be electrified. If we do that, we have a good chance against climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.